Welcome to Porch Play Chats, sponsored by the American Association for Promoting the Child's Right to Play, or more affectionately termed IPA-USA. IPA-USA is the USA affiliate of the International Play Association. You can learn more about us by going to IPAUSA.org. So, in order to facilitate additional topics around play, we created these porch play chats. And these are informal conversations with people who are just as passionate about play as we are. And so today, with me on the porch, I'm Deb Lawrence, and I'm the president of IPA USA. And with me on the porch is Lisa Murphy. Hi, Lisa.
Hello, nice to be here again.
Yes, good to see you. And with us is Nathaniel Bryan. And Nathaniel is an assistant professor in the Department of Teacher Education at Miami University. And so Nathaniel is here to be the second of a series. So if you haven't seen the first in the series, go back to our YouTube channel and look for it. The series is Play, Childhood, and Race, a vital topic for the times that we're currently living in, and we should have been doing it decades ago. Um, and Nathaniel's title for this second in the series is Why is this the current state of play and childhood and race? And so, Nathaniel, welcome. We're so glad you're here.
Thank you, and Deb. I'm glad to be here.
And we're curious, why is this the current state?
It will take me quite a long time to answer that question.
And you have 20 minutes in order to do it. You have.
So go.
But before I begin, I think it's necessary to foreground two important guiding frameworks or theories that will help me explicate the current condition or state of Black youth play and my own conceptualization and theorization of what I call Black play crit in my research. And so these two theories are critical race theory and Black critical theory. For those of you who may not be familiar with these frameworks, these are race-centered frameworks. For example, critical race theory centers on the notion that race and racism are foundational to American institutions, and that also includes the playground, be it school or community-based playgrounds, and that people of color face microaggressions, racial microaggressions, and macroaggression, given that race and racism are foundational to American society. I love CRT because CRT is a social justice framework, right? So it helps us to push back against issues of race and racism that may produce what Dr. Patricia Williams called spirit murder in the lives of people of color, right? And when I say spirit murder, I mean the psychological trauma associated with being a person of color in America. And building on the notion of critical race theory is this idea of Black critical theory. And Black critical theory addresses the specificity of the Black condition in America by naming what Michael Dumas and Kiana Ross calls anti-Blackness, right? And so they define anti-Blackness as this particular disdain and hate for Black children, for Black people, as reflected in the laws and policies of the land. For example, when we think about the Declaration of the Rights of Child, which we know was introduced in 1959, and that declaration came about during the Civil Rights Movement. And so we can't honestly say that, Black children had the right to play during that moment because we were still fighting for civil rights, right? And so we must think about the Declaration of the Rights of Child in a very critical manner to ask critical questions about whose rights were we advocating for. And we can clearly say that those rights weren't the rights of Black children, again, who were fighting for their civil rights in American society.
Well, and Nathaniel, one of the things that It is. So,
Yeah.
and so sad, right? My God, that was 1959 and we're in 2020 and here we are. Um, One of the things that uh, the International Play Association did decades ago was the Ewing Convention on the Rights of the Child, working with the UN, United Nations, to develop the Ewing Convention on the Rights of the Child, which is an amazing thing. And people can go to our IPA-USA.org website and learn more about the Ewing Convention. But the United States is the only country that has failed to ratify that, right? So it is the only country in the world that has failed. Let me just underscore that it is it is it is confounding to me that we are the only country in the world that won't even think about taking that up because
Right.
we're afraid of giving children, and could be children of color, could be not children of color, it could be, rights.
Right. Right, absolutely. So if we are denying white children's the right to play or the right to be children, imagine what we're denying to children of color, and particularly Black children who are
Mhm.
descendants of enslaved Africans.
Yes. And so let's just I want to get down to some practical application for our viewers and say, I'm the director of an early care and education program, or I'm an individual who does professional development on culture and race and ethnicity and discrimination or racial practices or white privilege. What what do I need to know? What do I need to be made aware of in order to get away from where we are right now?
That's a very good question. And I think any educator who works with children of color must focus on their own biases and stereotypes about those children. There have been several studies, particularly conducted by William Gillum and his colleagues,
Mhm.
that have spoken to the ways in which early childhood teachers have discriminated against young children of color on the playground, and particularly Black boys. And we know that Black boys are already labeled or stereotyped as bad and dangerous, etc. But when these things happen in early childhood spaces in classrooms, it makes the educational and schooling experiences of Black boys far more complex than it needs to be.
Mhm.
From
I
day
agree.
one. From day one.
Absolutely.
So I was in a classroom doing an observation a long time ago, and the teacher was white, and we have many wonderful, caring, loving teachers, and this one was just as caring and loving, but she didn't understand how her interactions with children were impacting them, right? She was just unaware because sometimes we just don't see that bias or discrimination.
Absolutely.
And so a child came in and she said, "Good morning, Sarah. So nice to see you. How was your weekend?" And she's like smiling and cooing. And a little white boy came in, Caucasian boy came in. "Jonathan, how was your weekend? So good to see you." So I saw her doing this. I'm like, "Oh, good, warm, loving, nurturing. Oh, here, let me check off all these little things on my box." And in walked a child of color, and she said, "Uh-huh."
Wow.
And she crossed her arms over her
Oh,
chest.
Deb.
Oh my God, it was awful. It it was it was awful. And this little boy's face, he walked in the door and he didn't feel like he would be welcome. And then when she did that to him, he just his eyes went down. I wish I was it was I'm old, so it was before we had iPhones. And so I could like pick out something and record his face, but I talked to her about it later and I said, "Why him?"
Wow.
And she said, "Oh, he's so much trouble. And, he's really rough and he's disrespectful." And I'm like, "He's 4.
Right. Right.
Let, let's unpack that a little bit more." And
But those are the everyday lived realities of Black and brown children in schools. You know, what you witness is not an anomaly. So we have to be careful about the ways in which we interact with young children, particularly children of color, because we're sending messages about whose lives matter and whose lives do not matter. And in this age of Black Lives Matter, or bringing in attention to the dehumanization of Black bodies in our society, it's very important that teachers are aware of the biases and stereotypes that may cause them to mistreat children of color in classrooms.
And I want to share something. Share something. I've not yet really had the opportunity to share this, and I'll make it general so it doesn't look like I'm finger pointing. I was at a conference, and the presenter was a woman of color who was presenting essentially a keynote about exactly what you're talking about. And I watched probably a third of the audience get up and leave. Wow. And she's like, this right here, and she called him on it while they were walking out. She's like, this is the problem. This is the problem. And I'll be honest with you, self-disclosure on my end, I had never really stopped to think about that, you know, about like the implicit. I had actually, honestly, I'll own this, I had never heard the phrase implicit bias until about 3-4 years ago. And then of course, because it's a new phrase for me, I'm like, I got to learn about this, right? And not only just learn about it, but I've got to figure out how to take action on this new knowledge that I'm giving to my own self. And so that to me as a presenter is a very unique position to be in, is that we need to be able to create environments where we can talk about it without getting so reactive to it, because that's not making it any better.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, and I would like to even say that oftentimes most of these reactions to, for example, the presenter, they're not really implicit biases. They are explicit Black biases,
Sure,
right?
They got up and walked out.
Often carefully taught to mistreat or treat particular bodies in particular ways, right? And it starts in the early childhood classroom where you see young children mistreating children of, white children, I should say, mistreating children of color, right? So we are all carefully taught to engage in those racist and biased practices.
And unpacking and unraveling that is a very delicate process, while at the same time, one of my personal biases is that it's taking too long. Like we've got to acknowledge that this is something that shoulda, coulda, woulda happened, as Deb said, years and years and years and years ago. So we want to honor the process of deconstructing it, while at the same time not get stuck in unpacking the deconstruction conversation that we never actually do anything.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I think in this moment where we have recently had several racial uprisings, you know, I think that the American consciousness is somewhat shifting, and everybody wants to engage. They want to confront these issues. However, you know, many people are protesting on the streets of America, but they have not taken the time to even consider their own biases and stereotypes that they bring to the protest, right? So it exacerbates the notion of racial justice. You know, when we have people who fail to examine themselves or to engage in critical introspection, or I like what Dr. Yolanda Sealy-Ruiz says, this archaeology of the self, really unpacking who you are to confront your biases and your stereotypes.
So, Nathaniel, as we're thinking about this from a teacher's perspective, or from a director's perspective, or from a professional development perspective, what are some tangible things that will not shut people down, but sort of open their minds to a different way of looking at things, so that we can begin to address these practices that are unfortunately throughout our society, but also in our classrooms? What can we do to help with play in our classrooms?
That's a very good question. And my first recommendation would be to listen, hear, and understand Black children as they engage in play. oftentimes, because of the biases and stereotypes that that teachers bring to classrooms, they uphold those as they perceive young children of color's play. And we need to really hold space for Black children and brown children to explain their cultural ways of knowing and being as they engage in play. Problematic is the fact that when we think about the literature, most of the literature centers on the play experiences of white middle-class children. So teachers naturally expect that all children engage in play in similar ways. And that's absolutely not the truth. We understand that young children of color bring their own ways of knowing and being to play experiences that need to be acknowledged and valued and considered in classroom spaces.
And so I think what might be really helpful is for us to sort of unpack that a little bit more. How might children of color's play look different than children who are white, so that teachers can begin to sort of wrestle with, and I know it's not universal, right? Because every child is different and every child has had different experiences, so I get that. But I think in order for us to be able to grapple with it, we have to have some idea of how it might look different and why we need to be more reflective instead of reactionary.
Absolutely, another good question. What I believe is that when children engage in play, they are acting out their own lived realities. And those realities can be strength-based or strength-based realities, or realities that are based on their condition of being oppressed in American society. Right? So I think we need to hold space to ensure that we understand and we learn from these students who are simply acting out their everyday lived realities and conditions in classrooms. And that's where we start.
I think that's perfect because, we are created from our experiences. And the way we know that children sort of work through issues is by playing.
Absolutely.
And so if we can look at it as a perspective, and we know that play is therapeutic,
Absolutely.
we know that children are trying to make sense of their world through their play. And so as a teacher then, we have to look at that as an opportunity of play being able to help them work through those issues, or give them so help teachers understand if they see something that maybe the child reenacting something or playing out a scenario that they've experienced, what could be a helpful way, instead of saying, stop doing that, you're being too rough, or no, that's not acceptable in this class, or no, you can't do that, right? What can we do instead?
Again, ask the child what's happening. Because I believe it's not only a learning experience for the child, it's also a learning experience for the teacher who is observing what's happening in the classroom space. So always taking time to listen, again, hear and understand the children you are interacting with or you are observing during moments of play.
And I think I think that was perfect, Nathaniel. Thank you.
And did I miss some, I'm having the Zoom issue today, so I had to run inside. So forgive me for that, and I lost a little bit of the context. I'd like to add that I think it's important for the adults to also have access to people who ask them those same questions, right? Why did you shut that down? Is it too rough or is it uncomfortable, right? And I think the multi-layers of interaction, I think, become very important.
No, and I think that was perfect, Lisa, because what Nathaniel was talking about, Nathaniel, I love how you said, listen, right? See what's happening, and then ask the child, what's happening in your play, right? Instead of, oh no, we're not doing that here. No, that's not allowed.
Absolutely. What is also often surprising to me, and for example, white boys oftentimes engage in the same kinds of play experiences as their Black boy counterpart, right? And white boys can be doing the most dangerous or engaging in the most dangerous kinds of play activities, but they will never be called out in the ways in which Black boys will be called out for similar play experiences. So again, we have a problem because we are allowing our biases and stereotypes to drive the way we perceive the play experiences of Black boys and children of color in general.
And again, fabulous, right? Because I think we need to maybe create some sort of a filter for ourselves as we're watching play with young children of all races and ethnicities. And we need to ask ourselves what makes us feel comfortable and what makes us feel not comfortable, and then dig deeper, as Lisa said. Why do you feel so uncomfortable about that?
Right, because I would ask that question when I see adults shut down children's play. It doesn't matter who's playing. My first question is, why did you do that? And so the bias could be, as Deb has pointed out too, is it could be an age thing, it could be a gender thing. It isn't necessarily always a color thing, but I think unfortunately often our conversation gets stuck in the color piece and not realize that the biases that we might have are in other areas. And I think that sometimes the conversation initially is easier, if I can phrase it like that, if we point out others. Like, it's not necessarily maybe as uncomfortable for somebody who's maybe having some first time conversations about bias, is to point out kind of the other areas where we can be biased.
I agree. I think that first and foremost, we must always keep race on the table, but we must also acknowledge the other intersections, including gender and class, that may also cause a teacher to discriminate or stereotype against a child. And that's one tenet of critical race theory, and it suggests that we acknowledge the intersectionality of race and racism, and which will allow us to see the varying ways that children of color may be treated on playgrounds and in classrooms.
And so, Nathaniel, another great aha moment, and one we need to dig into more deeply. But the other big piece I think we confront is that many teachers of early childhood programs are women.
That's true.
And so they have lots to unpack,
White
right?
women. Let's add that.
White women. And we love each and every one of you out there, by the way. But I do think that offers us even more challenges. You know, if our experience has been that we have not participated in rough and tumble play, or if we haven't, if we don't feel comfortable with roughhousing, then not only are we making boys of any color feel like they've done something bad, but we're also maybe deepening our discrimination against boys in general. And then you add the filter of boys of color on top of that, and we really get complex, right? So I think having that awareness is helpful, and I think you've given us some practical solutions, but what else can you help us with?
Well, I think we also need to hold space for parents of color to help inform our practices in classrooms. Parents of color bring a wealth of knowledge to institutional spaces that, much like the voices and experiences of children of color, those voices are marginalized. The voices of parents of color are marginalized. And we must have conversations with those parents as well, because they know their children better than anyone else, right? Mm-hmm. So I think, again, we need to find ways to hold space for those parents to inform us about how we can better support their children academically and socially, and during play in classroom spaces.
I would think also acknowledging that maybe that hasn't been the practice, and so we realize that might be like a quick turn, and realizing and appreciating that it might take a little longer for that invitation to be trusted as being an authentic opportunity for dialogue and conversation, because historically that hasn't been happening, or it was lip service, right? It was, we
Well,
were going through the motions.
I think that practice has happened in our classrooms, but we have to ask why and who it has happened for, right? And again, I think when we talk about white families and white mothers and fathers, I think we naturally value the voices of white families. And again, we ignore those voices of families of color. So I think we have to, again, be intentional about holding space for those voices that we tend to ignore, those voices we tend to marginalize or malign in institutional spaces.
And I would say for my own self, being willing to acknowledge that we haven't done that. Absolutely. And we're looking to make that pivot at this point. Absolutely. And yeah, maybe we should have done it 20 years ago, but we didn't. But we are doing it now.
Right.
So let's get that going.
So Nathaniel, one of the other things that I think might be helpful is to have staff that reflect the children in the classrooms, right? So if I'm in an area where the majority of my children are from diverse backgrounds and diverse ethnicities, but I only have staff of one color in my building, then I'm not, as a director, I need to be branching out and diversifying my staff so that if I have children from Asian culture, if I have children who are black and brown, if I have, any of those ethnicities or races, I have someone on staff that it is, and we know it's not all, we know it's not across the board, right? But at least we have a diverse staff that has an opportunity to give us their perspective if they feel safe enough in the environment and say, here's some things that we could do differently.
Absolutely.
And to be heard when they do that.
Right. I do agree that we need to prime the pipeline with the teachers of color. However, we need to be careful as we prime that pipeline because much like white people, people of color also internalize racism and racist practices, right? They too hold stereotypes and biases about the children of color. So we also must assist teachers of color in working through their own stereotypes and biases, and they too must engage in this archaeology of the self.
Oh, and I think that's such a good point because we're not here picking on people who are Caucasian, right?
Absolutely.
This is a systemic issue that has been around even within the Caucasian culture, right? We label people who are white who may live on the other side of the railroad tracks, or right? I remember the stereotypes that I was raised with, trailer trash, or, they're not good examples, or I would look at my mom and dad, who I love dearly and who were fabulous parents, but very discriminatory. And again, I'm old, so they were much older, right? But it became very evident that we have bias within our own ethnicity and our own race that we also have to confront. and so I think that's an important way for us to begin that journey of reflection and understanding what that implicit and explicit bias might look like for us.
Absolutely. We have lots of work to do on ourselves first and foremost.
So Nathaniel, one of the things as we're beginning to wrap up, one of the things I'd love is if you have any resources, children's books that talk about these things, teacher educator books that we could share with them that are, easy reads that they could get through and then maybe have a conversation. Maybe even books for administrators that could begin to have these conversations with their staff. And I'll put those with the YouTube video so that people say, I can say, Nathaniel gave us additional resources on this topic. But I think the more we can give them practical ways, just like you did in your many suggestions, we can give them tools
Absolutely.
that may help us move forward.
Absolutely. Two important texts come to mind, one by Dr. Gloria Boutte, which is titled Educating African American Children and How Are the Children? I think that's an excellent text that provides practical tools for teachers. And I believe it's written in such a way that will not shut down teachers, mainly white teachers. So I think it's a perfect text to begin with, particularly for those who are interested in confronting their own biases and stereotypes, and for those who are interested in improving the conditions of Black children and children of color in general.
Wonderful. So I've written that one down. Would you send me, you've got my email, would you send me a couple of other resources just at your leisure? It doesn't have to be today. I know school is in session and it's crazy, but that will help us provide some tangible resources for folks to be able to pick up and use as a discussion. I mean, a book club would be perfect in a child development program.
Absolutely.
To say, here's a book that we need to really be focused on, and so let's read a chapter and talk about it, right? So thank you so much, Nathaniel. This was amazing.
Thank you.
I'm
Thank you.
gonna close this out, but don't hang up. So today's so to learn more about our Porch Play Chats, make sure you visit IPA-USA.org. Up in that top right hand corner is our Facebook link and our link to our YouTube channel, which is where all the Porch Play Chats are going to be listed and released. And we do them once a week. And so you'll always want to be focusing on which ones we release that Monday. So thanks again for joining us for our Porch Play Chat, and keep playing.
Thanks, Nathaniel.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure having this conversation.